Now, this is version control software that will let you save your project at multiple stages, share it on GitHub, and work collaboratively more easily. As I mentioned a second ago, Git is a command line tool, so it's something that you will need to open your command line to use. So we will do that here in a second, but I'm going to go through some of the important commands in Git so you have a sense of what they are. So in order to actually do anything in Git, you have to prepare your folder. So generally speaking, what you would do is you would create a folder for a project. And so I'm just going to create a folder on my desktop called Workshop. Let's see. So I'll create this folder called Workshop. And this is where I'm just going to put all of the code and everything that we're going to do today in. OK? So as you can see, you just saw me create this folder. It's empty. Now, what I want to do is I want to go into my terminal, and I want to go into this folder. So I've just blown my own terminal up really large here so you can see it more easily. But this is just a brand new terminal, and I'm just going to change my directory, and I'm going to go to wherever I put that folder. Now, this might be different for you, but mine's just on my desktop, so I'm going to change directory into the Workshop folder. OK? Now, I want to use Git to keep track of everything that lives in this folder. Now, the most important command that you need to know for Git is the initialization command. And it very conveniently is git space init. When I hit enter, it will tell me that I have initialized an empty Git repository in users virth desktop workshop .git. OK? So I am now set up. So I can use Git to keep track of what's going on in this folder. OK? So that's the first step, is using git init. This creates the repository, and it sets things up to track. Now, often when you do a project, if you plan to share it with people, you will have files in your folder. Excuse me, you'll have files in your folder that you don't actually want to share with people. So what you'll likely want to do is you'll want to create a file called !gitignore. So this is just a text file that will tell Git to ignore certain files in your directory structure. OK? So in order to create this, what you'll want to do is you'll just want to open up a plain text editor. What we've been using in the Hacking the Humanities class and in the various other classes I've taught here is VS Code. But if you use Notepad++ or what is it, BB Edit or Text Edit or anything that lets you edit plain text will work just fine here. OK? So when I open this, it's just going to be an untitled folder, and I'm going to save this in my Workshop folder as .gitignore. So you can see I'm just titling it gitignore. And I'll hit save. So if you're on a Mac, you will get this nice little warning that says anything that starts with a period is reserved for the system. Just say go ahead and use it, because that's fine. This is a file that is being used by the system. And now I can just put in any file name here that I don't want GitHub to pay attention to. If you're on a Mac, for example, you might want to ignore the .ds_store file. This is a file that tracks the state of a folder on your Mac, and often you're not going to want to save this. You might have a folder that is like a data folder that contains, text files or spreadsheets or whatever that's not part of your coding project. Then you could say its name is /data, and it'll ignore that folder. OK? So anything you don't want Git to pay attention to, just stick it in here. So I'm going to save this. And then once I do that, I need to add files to my Git repository. Okay? So first of all, I need a file. So we're not going to get into the object-oriented programming quite yet here, but I'm just going to make a new file here, and I'm going to call it fun.py. And I'll save it. And so I have fun.py, and I'll say, print, hey, isn't this fun? And I'll save it. And now I have this fun.py in this directory. But I might want to use Git to pay attention to this file, so if I break it later, I can return to it, or I can do all sorts of things with it. So, if I go over here and I say python fun.py, I'll run it, and you'll say, hey, isn't that fun, right? So now I have a folder that has code in it. So I want Git to keep track of any changes I make to fun.py. So what I can do is I can say git add, and I can say fun.py. So if I run this, this will add fun.py to Git to pay attention to. So if I run this, it'll just give me a blank line. And so now Git knows about fun.py. But if I want to save the current state, then what I need to do is git commit, and then this will say commit this file to Git's memory. And it is conventional to give it a message, so I'll say -m, and then I'll say something like first commit. And this message here is just anything that I want to remind myself about what I did at this stage of the project. Okay? So I'll hit enter, and it'll say one file has changed, one has been inserted with one insertion, and it creates this thing, and now it knows about my file. So we now have a repository that is tracking actual code. Now, I can also add other code to this, another file. So let's add something that I'm just going to call like second.py, and I'll save this, and I'll say print code piece 2, and I'll save this again. And so what I can do now is I could add this file separately, or I could just say git add star, and this will add everything in that folder to my Git repository, okay? So it will add everything, and then what I can do is I can go ahead and I can commit again, and I can say add second.py as my message. I hit enter, and it'll say, hey, there's one new file, or it adds second.py, one file change with one insertion, create this, okay? So what this is letting me do is this is letting me create checkpoints. So every time I commit something, that is setting up a place that I could roll back to, potentially, if I do something really dumb. Like, in a case like this doesn't matter too much. But as you're working on larger and larger projects, it's very easy to be like, okay, now I'm going to add a new feature, and then code for 30 minutes, and then run it, and then realize you've completely broken everything, and you can't remember how to get back to the state where it was actually working. I've been there. It's not a fun situation. So this is one way of making sure that you don't do that. Now, there are a few other features that are important to know about in the context of Git. You can also remove files. So if you have been adding files and you delete something and you want to say, remove this from Git's memory, you can say git rm, whatever your file name is. That doesn't come up too often, but it's something that is useful to know how to do. But one of the really cool features of Git are branches. So anytime that I'm working on a project and I want to make a major change to what I'm doing, I can create a new branch. And this is a really cool thing. So if we look at my workshop folder right now, it looks like this. We have fun, second, and we have git ignore and the other things because I have my computer set to actually show hidden files. Now, let's say I want to add a fancy new feature to this. Well, when you create a Git repository, it creates a branch called the master branch, which is what we're working on right now. But I can create new branches for my new features. So let's say I'm going to add a third .py that potentially could break lots of things. What I can do is in my terminal, I can create a new branch. And the way that I do that is by simply saying git branch and then some name of whatever branch that I want to work with. So let's say, I'm going to say git branch new feature, something like that. So now I have this new branch that I can do a bunch of coding on without touching what's happening in my master branch. So to actually start using this, I can say git checkout new feature. So this will move me from my master branch to this new feature branch. Okay? Now, what I can do is I'm going to go back into my Visual Studio Code here, and I'll create a new file, and I'll call this third.py, and I'm just going to leave it empty because I don't actually care about adding any code right now. So now, if you look in my workshop folder, what we have is fun second third.py, right? So I'm coding away in this branch, and all of a sudden I realize everything I've done in this branch is bad. Well, I can go back to my master branch. So if I go git checkout master, and I go back into that folder, let's see here. Let's see. Oh, sorry, I didn't. I forgot a step here. OK? So I'm going to go back. I'm going to go to git checkout. What did I call it? New feature? Yeah. OK. New feature? OK. I have to add this. So I need to say git add all. And then I can say git commit m add third file. OK, so now Git is aware of this particular file. So then what I can do is I can go back to my master branch, assuming that I want to abandon the changes I've been making in this new feature branch. I can say git checkout master. And now you can see that that third.py disappears because it doesn't exist in that master branch. It actually exists in that other branch. And so the way that this will look kind of in the computers, in the GitHub repository's memory is we have a branch of code. This is our master branch that we're coding on, when I branch, what I'm doing is I'm creating a new line of code, and I am continuing along here. So this is my new feature branch. But maybe I have friends who are programming with me who are continuing to use this master branch and making changes. So eventually, assuming that I finish my new feature and I want to merge it back into this other branch, I can do that. And one of the nice things about Git is that it'll then tell me, here are all of the differences between your current branch and the master branch. Can you fix these things to make sure there are no errors, there are no collisions? And this is a really, really useful thing to be able to do. So let's see here. And in order to do that, all I need to do now that I am back here in my master branch is I need to use the merge command. So if I have decided that that new feature branch has code that I want to include in my master branch, all I need to do is say git merge new feature. And what it'll do is it will merge them together, and now everything's back in my master branch. OK? Does that make sense? Now, when you're working with small projects, this isn't necessarily that critical. But if you're working with collaborators, it is enormously useful. And as your projects get bigger and bigger, it's also a useful thing to be able to do. So it's never a bad idea to get in the habit of using Git. Now, it's not super critical, but it is something that I would suggest that you get in the habit of. You can also check out the history of what you've been doing if you just say git log. And it'll say, you know, here's my first commit. I made this on May 17th at 1:27. The second one was at, you know, a few minutes later. Excuse me. And then the third one happened here. And so you see these long hash numbers here. You can actually go back and reference these numbers if you want to return to old states in your code. Okay? Sometimes this is actually a very useful thing. When you are routinely committing things and you realize that you have really done something wrong, you can go back to one of these old states. Okay? To do that, all you need to do is create a branch from an old commit. We don't need to actually do this because we're not building anything at the moment, but I just want to familiarize you with this command. To do this, you just need to say git checkout -b old state and then that commit hash value, which was that big long number that you could use. So the last thing I want to say about Git before we get into actually building some Python objects is how to share code that has been saved with Git. And most people elect to use GitHub. GitHub is an online service that lets you share Git repositories. It's at github.com. It is now owned by Microsoft, and some people do have issues with that. There are open source versions of similar sorts of things like GitLab that if you're really anti-Microsoft, that's fine. You can use those. But all you need to do this is you just need to say git remote add origin, and then you give it a GitHub URL. Now, in this particular case, this repo.git doesn't really exist. But if you have a GitHub account, what you can do is you can create a new repository and give it a name, and that name will be name.git. And then you can say git push u origin master. So if you do this, it will have you sign into GitHub, and it will ask you for credentials and whatnot, and then you can say git push u origin masters, and all of the code that you just created in your local repository will be sent up to GitHub. And so then anybody online can look at it. So it's a very useful thing to be doing. What we will be doing now, though, is actually moving on to creating Python objects. But before we do that, are there any questions? Yeah?
What would happen if you tell git ignore to ignore itself?
That's a good question. My guess is it would probably just ignore it. Well, we can try, you know. Well, we can try later when we're not actually doing the workshop, but I don't know. Are there any other questions? Did you have a question? Two questions here. Yeah, go ahead.
So when you're in a branch, right,
Mm-hmm.
you can run your code
Mm-hmm.
without any trouble,
Mm-hmm.
and then when you go back to the other branch, the code will reverse to
Yes, correct. So when you go back to the other branch, and it will go back to whatever the current state of that branch is. And so you can merge things to make sure that everything is in the same state together.
But for example, if your code has made a certain file,
Mm-hmm.
will this file also disappear?
Yes. Yeah. Unless it's something that's not being tracked. So if it's in git ignore, it's just going to get ignored, and Git's not going to like hide it from you or anything like that. Yep. And yeah, question.
If I am working on branch new feature,
Mm-hmm.
the other one is working on the original master,
Mm-hmm.
and I merge them together,
Mm-hmm.
my new feature will override the developing master branch,
No.
or keep all the difference.
It will keep, so it will push them together, and as long as there's not an explicit conflict, it will just work. If they have changed something that you have also worked on, then there will be a conflict, and it'll ask you to resolve it. So it will not just overwrite anything. And that's one of the really nice things is it's very difficult to accidentally overwrite somebody else's changes. So yeah. And so if you've ever worked on an open source project and you've gone to GitHub, you can fork it, which is basically taking all of the code and copying it so you can work on it yourself. You can then add changes to somebody else's GitHub repository and then suggest to them that they, and I can never remember the terminology because I think it's make a pull request that is, hey, you should pull my code into your repository. The push-pull distinction in Git is a little hard to remember, at least for me. But yeah, so it won't overwrite anything. It'll ask you before it overwrites anything, I should say. Any other questions? All right, so, we're doing really well on time.